Well, let me pray, then we're going to get started in our message. Lord, thank you for this day. Thank you for organizations like Venture that go into dark places. I pray you be with our world changers that are out there in very difficult places. They're lonely, they're scared, they're sacrificing only so that you can work through them to bring the light to those dark places, Lord. That is who you are. It's what you came to do. It's what you've done from the beginning. You separated chaos and dark and light and gave us this planet, Lord, and gave us yourself. And so I pray that you would encourage our world changers, give them the resources and the strength to continue on, and help us to continue to remember and support them. I pray also you speak through me, that you'd help us learn more about you through Colossians as we talk more about it today. Thank you, Lord. Amen. Well, this is week 2 of our series in Colossians. It's called First Jesus. And really, one of the main points, among other things, of Colossians is the preeminence of Jesus. We're going to talk about that fancy word next week, or in 2 weeks. We're going to continue on the series. Next week, I've got a friend coming. If you don't remember, or we don't know, last fall I ran the Grand Canyon for Venture with a friend of mine. That friend does all kinds of crazy stuff to raise support and awareness for Venture, and he's going to come and speak on our 30 for Freedom weekend. So he'll be here next week. It's kind of a missions weekend, and we'll celebrate what we've done through our event, and then the week after we'll talk about fancy words like preeminence. But that's what Colossians is about, is before all else is Jesus, first Jesus. And so just kind of bring us up to speed from last week was a lot of background information. Unfortunately, the video didn't work, and so if you were curious if you weren't here and wanted to watch it, you can't, so you'll never know any of that stuff. It's too late for you. Make better choices. Just kidding. It is, the video is lost to time and eternity, but you're still welcome here. So Paul is writing this letter to the Colossian church, and he's writing it because the church is doing well, but ideas have crept in that are contrary to the gospel, and they threaten the very existence of the church. And that can feel dramatic, right? Like, how big of an idea does it have to be before the existence of the church is threatened? Well, it reminded me of a quote that I shared last week from A.W. Tozer in his book, The Knowledge of the Holy. He wrote this: "What we think about God is the most important thing about us. Our ideas about God matter, and when they get wrong, they can lead us in wrong directions." So we're going to be looking at what happened in Colossae and what can happen in La Crosse if we aren't diligent, right? We have to be on our toes. We worship the Lord our God with our mind as well as our heart and soul. This is one of the prison epistles. So along with Philippians, Ephesians, and Philemon, Colossians was written in prison, probably in Ephesus. We're not sure. As we're going to learn about Paul and about how he dealt with how to deal with certain issues in our lives, we need to remember that he's sharing what helps him stay true and faithful while in prison, while he's going through difficult things. This isn't just a letter for Colossae or for us. This is from Paul's own heart and experience. These are the things that he centers his faith around when times are tough. He didn't plant the church in Colossae. But he's in prison with their pastor, Epaphras. If you read the book, and I encourage you, we're going to be in this book for a while because I'm going to go slow and have fun with it. And so I encourage you just to be reading Colossians. Maybe read it. One way to do it is to read it. It's a short book, so read it real fast and then kind of go slow through it to kind of get some things. You're going to see the name of Epaphras a few times. It's because he's their pastor and likely planted their church. And as I said, among other things, this letter is about having a Christ-centered perspective on all things. So I'm going to read through our passage. We're going to cover a whopping 6 verses today. All right, so, which if you're part of, I participate in a small, a men's Bible study and a group of college students. We get together. In the men's group, we're talking about Colossians. In the college group, we're talking about Romans. And in Romans, it's not uncommon to get through like 6 or 8 verses in an hour and a half. So this is flying for me, is my point. I'm going to read this passage, and then we're going to go through it line by line. Here's Colossians 1, 9 through 14. "And so from the day we heard, we have not ceased to pray for you, asking that you may be filled with the knowledge of his will in all spiritual wisdom and understanding, so as to walk in a manner worthy of the Lord, fully pleasing to him, bearing fruit in every good work and increasing in the knowledge of God, being strengthened with all power according to his glorious might, for all endurance and patience with joy, giving thanks to the Father who has qualified you to share in the inheritance of the saints in light. He has delivered us from the domain of darkness and transferred us to the kingdom of his beloved Son, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. I was telling someone before service, I felt like as I was preparing for this that feel like I'm squeezing this into one message. This could be 2 or 3, but I'll do my best to not be here all day. You're welcome. Okay, verse 19a. So just the first part of the first verse. And so from the day we heard, we have not ceased to pray for you. So remember the context. Paul and Epaphras and others, they're named at the end of the letter. And we talked about that last week. He's in prison with a few people. And while there, they get a letter or someone comes to visit them and tells them, hey, this is what's going on back in Colossae. This is a city with some Christians, some Jews diaspora Jews have gone there. It's a Greek city under Roman rule, so there's a lot of cultural influences there. And so there's a lot that can happen. And now their pastor is gone, and some ideas, some people have kind of crept in, and they're getting confused. And it's a different kind of thing. Galatians is similar, but it's a different kind of issue. He doesn't ever identify specifically what the issues are, but we can get a sense of what the problems are from what he writes. So when he says from the day we heard, it's like from the day someone came and said, hey, Epaphras, oh, Paul, you're here too. Here's what's going on. What do we do about this? Or did you hear what these guys, they're trying to get some help. Their first reaction is to pray. And I'll admit, when I was a younger believer, this kind of thing annoyed me. Like, we just need to pray. And I always felt like a cop-out. Well, give me a really big idea. Here's the big idea. Ask God. Ask God for help. Their first reaction is to pray. But one thing that it isn't is self-pity. They easily could have said, like, that sounds rough. We're in prison, right? He could have said that. Instead, the reaction is to pray. Not like, wow, that's hard. You're at the coffee shop, going to Jules, trying to figure these tough questions out. That sounds bad, with the scones. Did they run out of scones too? That would make me sad, right? No, he's not saying that because they have the best scones in town, right? Hands down. He doesn't say that. The reaction is to pray. This reminded me of 2 Old Testament stories, David and Joseph. And of course, I got to go to Genesis somehow in every message. Joseph gets these visions, right? And it's clear God wants him to lead. God has called him to lead, and his brothers, take umbrance, right, with this. They don't like this idea, so they put him in a pit. They're trying to figure out what to do, as one does with an annoying brother. You put him in a pit while you work it out, and then they sell him, as one does. They sell him to slave traders, and he ends up in Egypt. Remember, he's called, and he's equipped. God equips us for the things he's called us to. So he has some of the stuff that he needs to lead, but now he's in prison. And he kind of ebbs and flows in that situation, but no matter where he is, whether in Pharaoh's house or in prison, he continues to lead. He continues to practice. He makes the prison run better. It works out for him and for the fellow prisoners, and he climbs in status in the prison. Eventually, he's second in command in all of Egypt. He practices. He uses his downtime to practice. He's in prison, and he could easily just sit there and pout. I'm going to wait till God does, if God really can, if God really cares, I'm going to wait till he does his thing and establishes me. He doesn't say that. Instead, God give me these giftings, and I'm going to use them. It's similar to me to David. David, when Samuel was looking for Saul's replacement, he goes to David's family, and he's going through all the brothers, and he's like, is there any more? And at first they're like, no. Like, there's David, but he's so insignificant, he's not worth mentioning. So they lie about having another brother. Like, no, it's not even worth talking about that guy. Isn't there another one? Okay, there's one more. David is a shepherd, and his brothers are bigger and taller and stronger and all this stuff, and they're in battle with Saul. And David is out, he's shepherding. And while shepherding, he doesn't have much to do. He later on becomes king in a song. He's like the warrior poet, right? He leads into battle and he writes songs, and he's just this incredible dynamic person. All those skills were honed while tending sheep. He defends his sheep from wild beasts with his slingshot, which means he practiced with his slingshot. And he writes songs and probably had some bummers, right? There's probably some songs like, no, we just don't want to share that one with people. That was rough. I was 13, I was feeling emotional. But he writes these psalms. I remember years ago when John Mayer was just coming on the scene. He was being interviewed by a radio station in Minneapolis, and I think he released his second album, and it was going well, and he's a really talented guy. And he says, well, I hope someday to write a really bad album. And what are you talking about? He said, well, all the great musicians have at least one really bad album, but they can keep going because they're so great, their fans stick with them. I hope to have that kind of career. And the interviewer's like, well, good luck on the bad album, John. Like, I don't know how to respond to that. David probably had some bad ones too, is my point. So David practices. He's out there by himself, and he's practicing with his slingshot, and he's practicing with his harp, and he's writing songs, and then he goes to visit his brothers, and there's Goliath, and Goliath is saying things that he can't tolerate, and he's ready for the battle, and he's ready to lead because he's been practicing. So often I talk to people who are like waiting for their thing to happen, and they just kind of refuse to be engaged at a level that is beneath them. And then they never get to do that thing they feel called to because they don't take the time to practice in the downtime. Paul and his friends, their first reaction is to pray. This recalls to me, for some reason, Jesus on the cross. He's on the cross. And he says, there's two thieves, and one is mocking him, and one's like, leave him alone. We deserve to be here, but he doesn't. And the thief just says, remember me. And Jesus is like, that's all I need. You get it. You're going to join me in paradise. And then he says, Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. They don't understand. They don't understand. He's on the cross saying they don't get it. They don't understand. Help them. That recalls a verse that I mentioned last week, Romans 12:2. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. Our minds need to be renewed. We need to learn to think like Jesus. And it takes practice. It takes testing, right? So graduates, the testing isn't over. It's going to continue. Right? It takes practice. But there's grace in that. This isn't, well, you failed, and so goodbye, you're done, you're kicked out of the program. No, we get it right, and we get it wrong, and we learn, and we practice, and we get better. Our minds become renewed. So from the beginning, Paul says, let's pray for them. And so they prayed. Moving on into the rest of verse 9. And so from the day we heard, we have not ceased to pray for you, asking that you may be filled with the knowledge of his will and all spiritual wisdom and understanding. The knowledge of his will. They're praying for specific things. The knowledge of his will, to understand what God has for you. It takes time and it takes practice. And there's lots of great ideas out there. What does God have for this church, for this person right now? Paul and his friends are praying for the Colossian church. We want you to know what God's will is, and that you would have spiritual wisdom and understanding. In another letter to another church, Paul wrote 2, maybe 3, maybe more, but possibly 3 letters to the Corinthian church, and those are very different than this letter. The Corinthian church was doing things, you're reading the letter, and you're like, you should have known not to do that. Like, you should know not to, shouldn't need a letter from Paul to know not to do some of those things. It's just, they got it really royally wrong. So Paul writes them a couple, 2 or 3, maybe more letters. In Corinthians 2:2, he says this. And I, when I came to you, brothers, did not come proclaiming to you the testimony of God with lofty speech or wisdom. For I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. Spiritual wisdom and understanding begins and maybe ends with Jesus Christ and him crucified. This is the most important element in Jesus' story, and I would argue, I would say, in history. And you might say, well, I don't really not sure I believe in Jesus. And that might be fine. Yeah, you can think that. You can have your opinion. But it'd be hard to argue, even from an atheist perspective, that the Jesus event, if you want to call it, didn't matter. Right? Like it changed things. Jesus changed things. In the story of Jesus, it is the most important thing. So the story of the Bible and our ideas about how we develop our ideas about God and understand God begin with Jesus Christ and him crucified. So when Paul goes to Corinth, he's like, this is the thing I need you to get. Jesus died for you. It is the most important thing. But some other ideas about wisdom and knowledge. In Proverbs 1:7, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, and fools despise wisdom and instruction. In Proverbs 1:29, because they hated knowledge and did not choose the fear of the Lord. The idea being that the fear of the Lord, not like a trembling kind of fear, but a respect, a reverence, that is going to lead you to wisdom. In the absence of a fear of the Lord, absence of reverence or respect for God is going to lead you away from wisdom. You might say, well, there's a lot of smart people that don't believe in God. That is true. And there's a lot of people who do incredible things that don't believe in God. That is true. There's a difference between knowledge and wisdom. When we're talking about ultimate truth, it begins with Christ and him crucified and a fear and respect of the Lord. Anything else is leading you away. So if you're trying to understand, to know, is this idea wise, is it good, those would be some questions to ask. Does this point to Jesus and him crucified or not? Does this lead me towards a fear and respect and reverence of God or not? If the answer is no, then it is not a wise thing. Spiritual understanding includes wisdom. It's the acquisition of knowledge and the application of that knowledge to a specific concern. Many of you students especially are feeling that way. I know a lot of stuff, but I don't know how to run a business, or I don't know how to, nurse, right? Or I joke with our nursing students, your job really is to reach in and just keep someone's heart going with your hand, right? That's what you do on a daily basis. So you want to know how to do that right, right? You got to get the beat right. So that's the job. So we want to understand things so we can make good decisions in difficult and for new problems, right? It's a combination. Knowledge applied is wisdom. We want to think and act spiritually. And this isn't just like I'm walking around worshiping, singing worship songs. This is me applying the wisdom of God, the fear of God, Christ and him crucified to every situation and growing in that. Again, there's opportunity to grow and to learn and to get better at it. So wisdom isn't a goal, it's a means to an end. It's a means to making good decisions. Let's move on. Verse 1:10, so we've covered one verse. So as to walk in a manner worthy of the Lord, fully pleasing to him, bearing fruit in every good work, and increasing in the knowledge of God. This is not merely knowledge, as I said, but wisdom with the purpose. We seek Christ-centered spiritual wisdom so we can honor Jesus, which leads to fruit. God's blessing on the works of good we do for and with him. And anytime you see the word works, especially those of us who grew up in the church, maybe grew up in an experience that felt kind of works-oriented or legalistic, this can kind of cause all kinds of red flags. This is the idea. We are prepared to do work with him, to help make this world look more like his kingdom, to bring his love and his light into the world. Those are the works of good that we're called and prepared to do. We don't just receive what Jesus has given us, but we follow him in to places like where Venture's going, into places like where you work and the school you attend and your family. Right? We are called to, prepared for works of good. So we want to do this in a manner that is worthy of the Lord, fully pleasing to him. And as we do this, it results in an increased understanding of God. Again, it takes practice. Sometimes you're going to get it wrong, and sometimes you're going to get it right, and you get an opportunity to learn. There's grace in that, right? We're not called to be perfect. We're called just to follow him the best of our ability. He will continue to renew our minds as we practice and begin to submit. The more we submit and align our lives with God's will and wisdom, the more we understand his will and wisdom. Some of us who have taught other people things, especially if you've coached. I mean, it takes a while for people to trust what you're trying to teach them, right? So often, especially coaching soccer with little kids, the basics of, like, when you kick the ball with your toe, it just goes farther, right? It feels good and just, boom, it's satisfying, but it's not accurate. So you're trying to teach them kick with the inside of their foot, and they're like, I don't want to because this goes farther, and it's awesomer, and awesomer is a word. And so you're just like, just trust me. Just trust me. Let's just practice this skill, practice this drill, and eventually they look back like, oh, I get it now. Right? I get it now. And that's what happens the more we submit to God. Even though there's a mystery to it, we're not sure, is this really the right thing? We're not sure, is this what you have for me? Or what am I doing it right? We submit to it, and then it begins to make more sense, and we get better at it. We get practice. The implication is that if we know the will of God, we'll have success in our Christian service. And a lack of success would suggest we may be outside of his will. Now, success, I'm not talking about mass numbers and TV shows and all that stuff. And Michelle jokes that chapter 2 fundraising campaign goes well. We're going to buy a plane. We're not going to buy a plane. That's not that kind of success we're talking about it. But the more we know and submit to and follow God's will, the more he can bless and do the kind of work he wants to do in and through us. It takes practice. Verse 11, being strengthened with all power according to his glorious might for all endurance and patience with joy. This increased Christ-centered wisdom and knowledge will make us stronger and more able to endure trials and challenges. There's hope in that, though it feels a little backsided, right? The fact is, life is hard, and it's going to continue to be hard. There's going to be challenges. At the end of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, he who builds his house on the rock, right, which is his teaching. If you follow my teaching, you're going to withstand the storms that are coming. It's going to come. Storms are going to come. And not if they come, or that might come, but they're going to come. And the older we are, the more like, yeah, there's storms. They're coming. Part of us hopes for a magic bean. Right? If I just believe enough, then all strife and complication will be removed from my life. Right? We kind of hope for that. And when it doesn't happen, we get a little salty. Yeah? It can be disappointing. Well, what am I doing all this for? Again, looking back, if I'm right, and if Paul is right, that the most important thing, the central truth, is Christ and him crucified, a death mechanism that was intentionally humiliating and painful, meant to scare your friends and family and your community. Some of those people that were crucified would take days, and we pictured Jesus up pretty high. Most of the time they were pretty low enough for wild animals to begin to eat you while you were still alive, which I know is graphic, but is how it worked. Jesus, the most important thing about Jesus, the central truth to history and all wisdom, is Jesus Christ and him crucified. Life is going to be hard at times. If he's who we're following into pain. Buddhism, and I had a period in my life where I really dabbled in and really was questioning my faith, and so Eastern religions, mystery religions were really attractive to me at the time, and so I was like, I think this is the way to go. Buddhism offers that. It offers that magic bean. It's really a way to distance ourselves from pain, which means separating ourselves from the world's problems, which means not sending food to places like Venture is sending food to, because that's too painful. Jesus is the exact opposite. Let's run there. Let's go there. Let's love those people that are dirty and forgotten and are lower than stray dogs. Let's hug them and tell them, you are made in my image. Life is going to be hard, but Jesus enters our pain. So one result of following Jesus and increasing in knowledge and spiritual wisdom is the ability to thrive in difficulty, endurance and patience with joy. Right? Endurance, enduring hard things with patience and a frown on your face. No, with joy. This isn't some kind of Pollyanna fake thing. This is real. real joy, confidence in who Jesus is and the work he is doing. But what if we lack wisdom? Well, we all do from time to time, and God is faithful to give it. The journey to wisdom begins with asking, fearing, and submitting to God. Let's move on to verse 12. Giving thanks to the Father who has qualified you to share in the inheritance of the saints in light. Remember, Paul is writing from prison, and yet he has the gall to write about being thankful. Like what? Enduring patience and joy. Giving thanks. These words, share and inheritance, are the words used for Israel's portion of the promised land. So the Jews and the Christians that would have received this letter, they would have had Paul's letters, maybe a few other floating around, and then the Old Testament. And one of the central stories is the Exodus story, and God's leading his people to the promised land. And so Paul says, share in the inheritance of the saints. And they would have gone, oh, I'm smelling what you're stepping in. Right? The land was symbolic of God's provision and redemption. It was symbolic of freedom and a new identity as God's people. We now share in the redemption and freedom provided in Jesus Christ. We are like them, Christians, humans, benefiting from the blessing of Jesus. Giving thanks. And he sets up the next verse. He's contrasting light and darkness, true and deception. This is similar to what he says in verse 5 of chapter 1, because of the hope laid up for you in heaven. Life is going to be hard, but there's hope. There's an inheritance coming. And Jesus is faithful to give you wisdom and to give you endurance and patience. The last couple of verses. He has delivered us from the domain of darkness and transferred us to the kingdom of his beloved Son, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sin. The domain of darkness is contrasted with the light we have in Jesus. So putting it together, wisdom begins and ends with Jesus. Remember, he described himself as the way, the truth, and the life. So you're not disagreeing with me, you're disagreeing with Jesus. Watch it. He is the beginning and end of wisdom. He's the true Occam's razor. Familiar with that? If the simplest answer is probably the right one. It's the easiest way to determine what is right and wrong. But the true Occam's razor is Jesus. Does the idea resemble Jesus? Does it point you to Jesus? Does it encourage you to act like Jesus? Does it make Jesus famous? Then it might be wise. It might be a good idea. Conversely, if something leads you away from Jesus, then it cannot be wise. It cannot be a good idea. When Jesus called Paul to the Gentiles in verse 26, he's relaying the story in chapter 26 of Acts. It says, you're called to the Gentiles, to whom I am sending you, to open their eyes so that they may turn from darkness to light and from the power of Satan to God, that they may receive forgiveness of sins and a place among those who are sanctified by faith in me. This is what Jesus is doing. He's calling us from darkness to light. And when we're having a hard time discerning, is this a good idea or a bad idea, we begin to ask questions. Does this look like Jesus? Does it encourage me to act like Jesus or not? One of the problems you will continue to face, graduates and everyone else in this room, is there are some ideas out there that sound pretty good. And they do. And the best lies, right, are a little bit true. We know that about what people say about ourselves and what people say about God. And then eventually they lead us away and we find ourselves in a completely different place. So we're going to be looking at this letter for help in discerning what is good and what is not, and what points us to Jesus and what does not. The differences aren't always clear. Worship team, you can come up. And sometimes bad ideas have enough good in them to be really convincing. But this is not a harsh letter. This is not a scolding letter. It's a letter of help. There's grace in that, right? We're going to get it wrong. We're going to get it right. But as long as we're trying to make Jesus central to our thinking, to our lives, Jesus will continue to work on us, work with us, work through us, do works of good. The fact is, we all have some wrong ideas, and God is patient and faithful to help us to get right on track. So if you're graduating and wondering what in the world you're going to do next, because for the first time in your life, your fall schedule has not been set for you, right? God knows your worry and wants to give you knowledge of his will and spiritual wisdom. And if you're a parent and made the mistake of thinking it'll be a while before the next surprise, you're not alone. God wants to help. Or if you're not sure if you're spending your days, no matter how many are left, the best way, God has works of good for you. We just need to seek him. Give me wisdom, Lord. Lead me into the works of good you have for me. We're going to sing one more song. And I just encourage you to take this moment and just make yourself available and to begin to practice. Lord, seek me. Or speak to me. I need your help. I need to know what you have for me. I need the knowledge of your will, and I need spiritual wisdom. There are problems that I don't know how to answer them. Please help me to understand. Help me to know. I will tell you, in my own life, I began years ago because the job I had, I was making so many decisions. I prayed daily, Lord, give me wisdom. And the more I did that, and the more I just gave myself time to pause, the more God spoke to and through me. And I would be in these meetings and these conversations making decisions like, wow, I don't know where that came from. God was giving me what I asked for. He wants us to understand him, to know him more fully, follow him more closely. You're not alone. Let's pray. Let's worship.